Welcome to the CPP Mastery Series. In this session, we are going to challenge one of the most important assumptions in modern cybersecurity. Are we actually solving the right problem? There is a simple principle that should guide every security professional. Security is not about building more defenses. It is about protecting what matters, in the right way. And that leads us to a provocative question. Are we catching the cybersecurity bull from the wrong end? Let's begin. Cybersecurity has become increasingly complex. Every new threat seems to produce another technology, another security platform, another control, and another layer of protection. But complexity itself can become a vulnerability. We often respond to cyber risk by adding more tools, more detection, more monitoring, more alerts, more dashboards, without first asking whether the underlying security architecture is fundamentally sound. The better question is not, what security technology should we buy next? The better question is, what are we actually trying to protect, from what, and why? Effective cybersecurity begins with understanding the business, its critical assets, its dependencies, and the consequences of failure. Only then should technology enter the conversation. In other words, we need to move from technology-first security to risk-informed security design. Look at the cycle shown here. A threat emerges. Detection improves. Attackers adapt. Malware evolves. New controls are installed. And the cycle begins again. This is the reality of modern cybersecurity. Attackers do not remain static. They learn from our defenses, modify their techniques, and search for the next weakness. That means a security strategy based entirely on detection and reaction can become an endless arms race. We detect the attack after something has already changed. We respond. The attacker adapts. We deploy another control. And the cycle continues. The CPP mindset requires us to step back from this cycle and ask a deeper question. Why are we allowing the organization to remain permanently reactive? The objective is not simply to become better at detecting attacks. The objective is to reduce exposure, understand risk, strengthen resilience, and make the organization harder to compromise in the first place. And this brings us to what I call the complexity trap. We frequently respond to weaknesses by adding another layer of technology. Antivirus, endpoint detection, email security, firewalls, VPNs, IAM, SIEM. And the list continues to grow. None of these controls are inherently bad. In fact, many are essential. The problem occurs when technology begins to compensate for weak foundations. If identity is poorly governed, adding another monitoring tool does not solve the fundamental problem. If assets are not properly understood, sophisticated detection cannot protect what the organization does not know it owns. If users have excessive privileges, another security platform may simply generate more alerts about the same underlying weakness. And if governance is weak, technology becomes a collection of disconnected controls rather than an integrated security strategy. Strong security technology cannot compensate indefinitely for weak security foundations. That is the complexity trap. Now we arrive at the central idea of this entire discussion. Imagine trying to secure a building by installing increasingly sophisticated alarms while ignoring the structure of the building itself. That is essentially what the left side of this illustration represents. We keep adding technology, controls, and sensors, but the foundation remains weak. The result is an increasingly complicated security environment without a corresponding increase in security assurance. The right side represents a different philosophy. Start with the foundation. Understand the assets. Understand the business processes. Understand the risks. Understand the threats. Establish governance and accountability. Then build the appropriate security architecture around those requirements. So the question is not whether we need cybersecurity technology. Of course we do. The question is whether technology is being applied after we understand the risk, or before we understand the risk. That distinction is critical. We may be very good at catching the bull, but if we are standing at the wrong end, we may be solving the wrong problem. The final concept in this opening sequence is the illusion of absolute classification. Organizations often classify information as confidential, restricted, secret, critical or sensitive. Classification is important, but classification by itself does not create security. A document labeled top secret is still vulnerable if the wrong people can access it. A highly sensitive database is still exposed if identities are poorly managed. And information marked as critical still needs appropriate protection across its entire lifecycle. There is another important issue here. When organizations begin treating everything as critical, nothing receives meaningful prioritization. Security resources are limited. Time is limited. Budgets are limited. People are limited. Therefore, the security professional must distinguish between what is merely important and what is truly consequential to the organization. That brings us back to the central philosophy of this session. Good cybersecurity is not about protecting everything equally. It is about understanding what matters most, understanding the risks surrounding it, and applying the right protection at the right point. And that is where cybersecurity begins to move from technology management to security management. This brings us to a fundamental question. Do we really need to classify almost everything? Traditional security models often create multiple classification levels, with the assumption that restricting more information automatically produces better security. But there is a hidden cost. When too much information is classified, access becomes unnecessarily difficult. Users spend more time navigating approvals, permissions, and administrative processes, and eventually, they begin looking for ways around the system. A more resilient approach starts with a different principle. Unclassified should be the default. Only information that genuinely requires additional protection should receive stronger controls. Notice the difference between the traditional model and the modern resilience model. Instead of 8 or more restrictive tiers, we can think in terms of a much simpler structure: unclassified, confidential, and secret, with protection driven by actual risk. The objective is not less security. The objective is less administrative complexity and more meaningful protection. Now we encounter a very important paradox. A system can be secure and still fail. How? By becoming so restrictive that legitimate users cannot access the information they need. Imagine an employee who needs operational data but repeatedly encounters classification barriers, approval delays, or complicated access procedures. Eventually, people find alternatives. They may send information through personal email. They may use messaging applications. They may move files to uncontrolled cloud storage. And suddenly, the security system designed to protect the information has actually created a greater vulnerability. This is why cybersecurity cannot be separated from operational usability. If legitimate users cannot use the system effectively, they will create their own systems. And those unofficial systems are often far less secure. Therefore, accessibility is not the opposite of security. Well-designed accessibility is part of security. So how do we move forward? We move from a classification-centric model to a protection-centric model. The old approach is essentially linear. Classify, restrict, protect. And once the classification is established, it tends to determine access for a long period of time. But modern environments are dynamic. A user's role changes. A business requirement changes. The sensitivity of information changes. Threats change. And therefore, authorization must also be dynamic. The modern model is better represented as a security gateway. Identify, authenticate, authorize, monitor, protect, recover. Notice what has changed. Classification is no longer the entire security mechanism. It becomes one input into a broader risk decision. The real question becomes: who is requesting access, why do they need it, what exactly do they need, and what is the risk of allowing that access? This takes us to the concept of legitimate need. Instead of asking only, what is the classification of this information, the security architecture should continuously ask questions about the request itself. Who is this person? Why do they need the information? What exactly are they allowed to see? For how long do they need access? And perhaps most importantly, can they alter, download, forward, or redistribute it? These questions transform access control from a static permission into a contextual security decision. A user may legitimately need access today, but not tomorrow. They may need to view information but not modify it. They may need one specific dataset but not the entire system. This is the essence of least privilege and need to know, supported by identity, authentication, authorization, and continuous monitoring. The objective is not to make access impossible. The objective is to make legitimate access easy and inappropriate access difficult. Now we can build the larger picture. Cybersecurity resilience is not created by purchasing the latest security technology. Technology sits much higher in the pyramid. The foundation begins with something much more fundamental. Elimination of unnecessary exposure. If a system, account, service, port, application, or privilege is not required, removing it eliminates an entire category of potential risk. Above that comes secure architecture, then identity and access control, then segmentation and containment, then detection and response, and finally, recovery and continuity. Antivirus and other security technologies still have an important role, but they should not become substitutes for the foundation. Think of it this way. You cannot build resilience by strengthening the roof while leaving the foundation weak. Every layer has value, but the lower layers determine how much the upper layers have to compensate for weaknesses below them. And this brings us to perhaps the most important principle in this entire section. Perfect cybersecurity is impossible. At some point, a control may fail. A credential may be compromised. A vulnerability may be exploited. A sophisticated attacker may get through. The question for the security professional is therefore not, how do we make a breach impossible? The better question is, how do we design the organization so that a breach does not become a catastrophe? Look at the contrast. The fragile architecture assumes that the perimeter or a single control will stop the attacker. Once that control fails, the damage spreads. The resilient architecture assumes that some controls may fail. Therefore, it uses segmentation, containment, limited privileges, monitoring, recovery mechanisms, and controlled dependencies to prevent one compromise from becoming an organizational crisis. Resilience is not the absence of failure. It is the organization's ability to absorb failure, contain its impact, continue operating, and recover quickly. And that is the mindset we need to carry forward as we examine cybersecurity, not as a race to build more defenses, but as a discipline of designing an organization that can withstand failure. This brings us to an important opportunity for emerging economies. They do not necessarily need to reproduce the extremely complicated cybersecurity ecosystems developed by advanced economies. In many cases, complexity is the result of years of accumulated technology, legacy systems, fragmented infrastructure, and layers of controls added over time. Emerging economies have an opportunity to take a different path. Instead of asking, how can we build the same number of security layers? We can ask, how can we build a simpler and more resilient architecture from the beginning? Fewer unnecessary connections. Stronger foundations. Better identity management. Simpler classification. Effective segmentation. And faster recovery. This is the concept of cybersecurity leapfrogging. Just as some economies moved directly to mobile technology without building extensive legacy telephone infrastructure, cybersecurity can also leapfrog unnecessary complexity. The goal is not to have fewer security capabilities. The goal is to achieve greater resilience with less unnecessary complexity. So what would this redesigned cybersecurity arena look like? First, fewer doors. Every unnecessary connection is another potential pathway for compromise. Second, stronger foundations. Secure architecture must come before layers of defensive technology. Third, simpler classifications. We should focus protection on information that genuinely matters rather than creating administrative barriers around everything. Fourth, tighter identity controls. We need to know who is requesting access, why they need it, and what they should actually be permitted to do. Fifth, better segmentation. If one environment is compromised, the attacker should not automatically gain access to everything else. And finally, faster recovery. Because resilience means preparing for the possibility that something will eventually fail. Put these 6 principles together and we begin to redesign cybersecurity from the ground up. Less complexity, stronger foundations, better visibility, smaller blast radius, faster recovery. That is a much more sustainable security model. And this brings us to the central question with which we began. Are we protecting everything, or are we protecting what truly matters? Cybersecurity is not a competition to accumulate the greatest number of tools, controls, classifications, or security platforms. More security does not automatically mean better security. Better security means smarter security. It means understanding the organization, identifying what is truly critical, understanding the threats and vulnerabilities that matter, removing unnecessary exposure, designing strong foundations, controlling legitimate access, segmenting the environment, and ensuring that when something eventually gets through, the organization can contain it, continue operating, and recover. So perhaps the biggest lesson from this session is this. Don't build security around fear. Build security around what matters. And don't ask only, how do we stop the attacker? Ask the more important question. How do we ensure that the organization remains resilient even when the attacker succeeds? That is the shift from security as a collection of controls to security as a business capability. Thank you for joining me in this session of the CPP Mastery Series. I hope this discussion has challenged the way you think about cybersecurity and, more importantly, the way you approach security decisions as a professional. In the next session, we will build further on these principles and continue examining how a CPP professional turns security challenges into structured, risk-informed decisions. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next session.